Hey y'all! Happy Saturday! Today I thought I'd read to you from my standalone romance novel. It's called Trashy Romance Novel. It's about a young lady who writes a trashy romance novel. It becomes adapted into an 8-part miniseries, and she flies to Scotland for the filming and falls in love with one of the actors who looks like Colin Farrell. I mean, he can look like whoever you want him to look like, but in my mind, he's definitely Colin Farrell. I wrote this because I was told over and over, if you want to make money as an author, write a trashy romance novel. And at first I'm thinking, well, I don't know how to do that. But I thought, maybe one of my characters could write a trashy romance novel and I could tell her story. As I wrote it, though, it actually ended up being more of a love letter to Scotland than anything. Scotland is the land of my dreams, and I love it and I miss it every day. And sometimes when I read this book, it kind of helps me return, if only for a little while. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy Trashy Romance Novel. Oh, and it begins with an excerpt from the book she, my character Delaney Brooks, actually writes in the book. And the first of her books is called The Queen's Surrogate, and I will let her explain to you what the books are actually about. Prologue of The Queen's Surrogate. Queen Annette had been a disappointment from the moment she was born. A daughter, my lord, Therese, her mother's midwife, had announced as she handed the new baby over to her father. Another daughter, the wealthy landowner grumbled. He already had a daughter, an ugly daughter at that. There was no way he could hope to advance his family's stature by marrying off his firstborn, Jane. He'd be lucky to find a pauper desperate enough to marry her. Well, I hope this one is pretty. Annette did grow to be pretty, tall and graceful, with long ebony hair and amber eyes that glowed with the sunset. In that, she was not a disappointment. However, she was not nearly as clever as her older sister, nor as strong, nor as fine a singer. It was not that she didn't try. Her parents found her the finest tutors in the land, but when they tried to teach her words on a page, she simply could not see the words as her tutor described them. It's a good thing she has that face, they all remarked to her father. Without it, she would amount to nothing at all. Although not as witty, Annette was a kind and gentle girl who showed great compassion to everyone around her. That, along with her resplendent beauty, had been why King Malcolm had selected her for his son, oh my goodness, I messed up. Forgive me. That, along with her resplendent beauty, had been why King William had selected her for his son, Prince Malcolm. In the king's mind, she was just the sort of lady that his rebellious, stubborn, thick-headed son needed. Now, she had disappointed him as well. Your Majesty, the Queen is barren, the royal surgeon announced after an extensive evaluation of Annette's body. Deep down, it was nothing she hadn't known. In the 10 years she'd been married to Malcolm, she'd suffered 7 miscarriages and delivered 2 stillborns. It had been 4 years since she'd managed to conceive at all. The king's advisor, a sleazy, rat-faced man named Wrigsley, though Annette had never been quite sure whether that was his first or last name, to her it sounded like something she might call a dog, tried to appear distraught, but Annette knew he was secretly delighted. Wrigsley adored conflict and despised the Queen. Her failure had presented him with the opportunity to step up, and the only thing Wrigsley loved more than conflict was proving that he was smarter than everyone around him. How can this be? Malcolm asked, staring down at his queen. I'm sorry, my lord. And she was. The one thing she was supposed to be able to do, not only as queen, but as a woman, and she couldn't even get that right. The king's steely blue eyes were cold. He was a good man, and he'd never given her a reason to fear him. But in that moment, Annette felt a sliver of uncertainty. What would become of her now that she could not produce an heir? Would he get rid of her? Send her to a nunnery? What if he locked her up? Or worse? No, Malcolm would never do that to her. Even if she couldn't give him the son he needed, he would never hurt her. But he still needed a son. So what do we do? Samuel, the old viscount who had been Malcolm's father's friend, advisor, and confidant, asked. We need an heir. The kingdom must have an heir. unless you want it to go to your no-good cousin in Glenberry. If your majesties would permit me, Wrigsley intervened with an oily tone that made Annette's skin crawl, I believe I might have a suggestion. Chapter 1. This is the actual book now. It all started with a crush. How cliché is that? I mean, of all the things to motivate a person to do something, how often does it go back to a silly infatuation? More often than most of us would probably care to admit. Of course, this wasn't an ordinary crush on a cute coworker or a charming friend of a friend I hooked up with at a party. No, I've never met the man who inspired my books. But I'm about to. That's right. At this very moment, I am en route to the Scottish Highlands, where a production crew is preparing to film the long-awaited television adaptation of the Surrogate series by Lorelei Dubois. That's me, by the way. I'm Lorelei Dubois. My real name is Delaney Brooks, but when I first decided to try my hand at trashy romance, I also decided I didn't want anyone I actually knew to know what I was writing. Well, that's not entirely accurate. Everyone knows I love to write. I just didn't want them to know that I was writing 16th century smutty fan fiction featuring a character who happens to bear a striking resemblance to British heartthrob and the not-so-secret object of my desire, Matthew Kent, who, wouldn't you know it, was cast as said character in the upcoming drama series, which, I'm told, is guaranteed to be equally trashy, but much less smutty. Thank God. I never intended for anyone to actually read The Queen's Surrogate, or any of its sequels. It started out as a fun side project for me to enjoy while I tried to finish up my PhD in English at the University of North Texas. I say tried because I didn't actually finish. Writing a terrible romance series that somehow became an international bestseller kind of got in the way of me graduating. Perhaps calling my own books terrible is a little harsh. But if I'm being totally honest with you, they're not good. The idea for the story came to me one night as I was cruising my secret Tumblr account for new pictures of Matthew Kent. I found a still of him from one of his movies in which he plays a sexy 19th century vampire hunter. In the picture, he's crouching in a graveyard behind the vampire's tombstone, and he's wearing one of those flowing white shirts, you know, the kind that you usually see on Disney princess. He's covered in dirt and blood, his wavy light brown hair is falling down and around his face, and he's sporting a really rugged beard. It's pretty much the hottest picture of anyone in the history of ever. I've never been very good at dating. Most of the men I know exist as words on the pages of books I can't seem to stay away from. You know the old saying, those who can't do, teach? Well, I have a little saying of my own. Those who can't date, write. That's how Matthew Kent became the inspiration behind the girlish fantasy that eventually evolved into the ultimate guilty pleasure romance series. The Queen's Surrogate, The Surrogate's Princess, The Surrogate's Tutor, and The Surrogate's Affair. The story goes something like this. The king and queen of the fictional country of Eden need an heir, but the queen has just been declared barren. So, as per the evil advisor Wrigley's suggestion, King Malcolm, inspired by Matthew Kent, decides to hire a young maiden from the village to become the queen's surrogate. After a series of competitions and challenges, Corinne Fletcher, a farmer's daughter, is chosen to bed the king and bear his child. Like I said, it's a really dumb story. Admittedly, it was a lot of fun to write. I mean, a lot of fun. But still. Of course, in the end, Malcolm and Corinne don't end up together. He does fall in love with her, in the beginning anyway, and she enjoys her task of making love to him a lot more than she was supposed to. But as the story evolved, she actually began to fall in love with her tutor, a brilliant young man who also happens to be Queen Annette's cousin. I honestly never intended for that to happen, and I find it so interesting how characters in stories often go off on their own, in spite of whatever the author has to say. When the producers first contacted me about filming a television series based on the books, I thought they were joking. Then I thought that even if they were serious, there was no way that it would ever actually happen. I've met several writers who've penned screenplays and signed over rights to movies that were never made. There was always a hitch, some dispute over the contract, or perhaps a scene that the producers hated, but the writer refused to change. But for the Surrogate series, there were no such hitches. The contracts were signed, the actors were cast, and the day after tomorrow, production officially begins. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I'm terrified. How can they expect me to act like a normal human being when real-life people are going to be acting out my trashy romance novel? My best friend Gemma, on the other hand, is thrilled. She's traveling with me and gets to act as my personal assistant. Of course, what that really means is that I didn't want to go by myself, and I figured it might be less awkward if I had her there for emotional support. There's no way she'd ever fetch me coffee, unless I paid for it and offered to buy her one as well. I still can't believe this is actually happening, Gemma just whispered. We're somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. It's the middle of the night, and most of our fellow passengers are sleeping, or at least attempting to sleep. Gemma and I, however, are both wide awake. Flying first class to Scotland and meeting Matthew Kent, not to mention Genevieve Brown, Rose Cervantes, Colin Ward, Benjamin Windham. Did you ever imagine even once that one day all those famous names would be playing your characters on television? Never in my wildest dreams, I admit. And it's the truth. Not just because I never dared to dream that anyone would ever create a television series based on my work, but because most of those actors are not what I envisioned for my characters at all. With the exception of Matthew Kent, of course. But Genevieve Brown is far too young to play Queen Annette. Rose Cervantes is incredibly thin and petite, quite the opposite of the curvy and voluptuous Corinne Fletcher. Notorious Hollywood rebel Colin Ward is way too hot to play the scheming, greasy Wrigsley. And don't even get me started on Benjamin Windham, who will portray Tristan, Corinne's tutor. Tristan is supposed to be handsome in a subtle, scholarly way. Benjamin Windham is those things, but he's also known around the world as Great Britain's greater playboy. But you know, for the amount of money they paid me to turn my books into a television series, they can cast whoever they want. I'm sure all the actors will do an amazing job. Besides, it's not like these books are my pride and joy. Not by any means. So while you're there, am I allowed to call you Delaney? Or is everyone on set supposed to know you as Lorelei? Gemma asks. That's a very good question, actually. One to which I haven't really given any thought. I've been too busy planning out exactly what I'm going to say to Matthew Kent when I meet him for the first time. So far, all I've come up with is, "Hi, I love you. Can I have your babies?" That's probably not gonna fly. Call me Lorelei. I don't need my real name getting back to anyone. There really aren't too many people out there who know that Delaney Brooks is secretly Lorelei Dubois. My parents know, of course, a few close friends, but everyone else is totally in the dark. Let's face it, penning a novel that the New York Times calls sinfully satisfactory isn't exactly something you brag about at family reunions. You've got it, Gemma says. Then she closes her eyes. For a brief moment, I think she's drifted off to sleep. But then she asks, you know the only thing that sucks, though? What's that? She opens her eyes and looks at me. No one knows. What do you mean? I mean, we're about to have this amazing adventure with some of the hottest celebrities on the planet. And we can't tell anyone without totally blowing your cover. That means no pictures with Matthew Kent, no updates from all the tourist traps we'll be visiting on our days off, no bragging about all the hot Scotsmen we get to hook up with. You know, we can tell people we're in Scotland. We just can't tell them why, I remind her. Besides, we can share pictures on my author sites. You're missing the point, Delaney. What is the point? The point is that we have direct access to Tommy Riggs, Gabe Abrams, Jillian Seabury, and all of our other high school nemesis through social media. We could be rubbing all of this right into their cyber faces, and yet we can't. That is unfortunate, I quip. Oh, come on. Tell me you haven't fantasized about all those jerks finding out who you really are, who you've become. Gem, high school was more than 10 years ago, I remind her. Yeah, and may I remind you that you skipped the reunion because of them. Don't even pretend like you're over it, because I know you're not. I really don't want to talk about the it to which she's referring. I'd rather sit back, turn on a movie, and try to get some rest before we land in Edinburgh. But Gemma likes to talk, especially when she's convinced she's right about something. I am over it. My therapist says I'm over it. Even my horoscope says I'm over it. I know you worry about me. I do. And I appreciate it. But right now, all I need you to worry about is making sure I don't make a complete and total fool of myself tomorrow. Finally, Gemma laughs. Sweetie, I'm your best friend, not a miracle worker. If you would like to read more of Trashy Romance Novel, it's available on Amazon as well as Kindle Unlimited, so those of you with a subscription can read it for free, and I will be returning to it in the days to come. Stay safe, everyone!